A good day, everyone. Welcome to this Chatham House webinar on the future of trade flows and supply chains in Asia. We're delighted that so many of you have taken the time to be with us today. This is the first of 4 webinars that we're doing this year on the broad topic of Asia Pacific in a dynamic world. And obviously the region coming out of the pandemic is going to face a fresh set of policy challenges, which we hope to discuss during the course of the year. I'd like to thank AIG for their partnership and support of this series. And indeed, we have with us today Stephen Barnett, who's the regional head of AIG Asia Pacific with us. Now, trade flows and supply chains were a contentious issue even before the pandemic, mainly because of the tensions we saw between the US and China. But you know, over the past few weeks, we've seen supply chain disruptions on a scale that we've never seen before. And obviously, the pandemic was a great accelerator in terms of shortages of medical equipment, shortages of masks. And what's beginning to happen now, particularly with the supply chain disruptions, and besides the ship blockage in the Suez Canal, we've also seen there's a global shortage of containers, and I don't think we've ever expected that because of supply chain disruptions, we're going to see shortage of containers, delays in ports. And all of this has a huge impact on Asia because Asia is the biggest beneficiary, not only of globalization, but of trade and investment over the last few decades. And all of this is going to have a macro impact. And we've got a terrific set of panelists today to help us navigate through the issues. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping details. This event is on the record, and indeed it's being recorded for streaming on chathamhouse.org. We'd love to have your input. We would love to have your questions. So please do use the Q&A button and send me as many questions as you can. I'll try to sort through them as our panelists deliver opening remarks. And then we hope to have as interactive a session as possible. Now for our speakers, we've got Cyn-Young, who's from the Regional Cooperation and Economic Research Department of the Asian Development Bank. She's a director there, focused on issues of how Asia can integrate better. Before the ADB, Cyn-Young used to be with OECD. We have Min Zhu, who is former Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, former Deputy Governor of the People's Bank of China. Min has focused on these issues both at the central bank level and at the global level at the IMF. So we're delighted to have him here. He's currently the chair of the National Institute of Financial Research at Tsinghua University in Beijing, which I think is his alma mater. We're waiting for our third speaker, which we hope he will join us. That's Montek Singh Ahluwalia. He is the former deputy chairman of India's Planning Commission and has held stellar roles in Indian economic policy making for the last 3 decades. Now, before I open the floor for Cyn-Young to deliver opening remarks, I'd like to give Stephen Barnett an opportunity to say a few words on behalf of AIG. Stephen?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. As I've been introduced, my name is Stephen Barnett, and I am the Regional CEO for APAC at AIG. I am delighted to welcome you to the first webinar in the Chatham House series, Asia Pacific in a Dynamic World, supported by AIG. AIG is a long-term partner of Chatham House, and we're extremely proud to support the Asia Pacific program. This is a 4-part series looking at how the region should best prepare for the post-pandemic future. Experts at Chatham House are grappling with issues which profoundly impact the environment in which businesses operate. For companies like AIG, trying to anticipate changing risks in order to help our clients mitigate them, engaging with Chatham House's deep research and objective analysis of trends is hugely valuable. particularly now as we're all trying to understand how the pandemic will reshape our societies, the global economy and geopolitics. A premise of this series is that the scale of the global challenge in 2021 makes the exchange of ideas and perspectives between governments, think tanks and business more important than ever. Discussions in this new series will highlight the role of business and social actors in ensuring that APAC remains an engine of growth and innovation after COVID-19. This is a critical subject for AIG, which was founded in Asia in 1919 and remains a major insurer in the region, helping companies and individuals across APAC to manage risk and achieve resilience in the face of economic and geopolitical uncertainty, as well as the challenges presented by pandemics and climate change. Today's webinar will focus on the future of trade flows and supply chains in Asia, as we seek to better understand supply chain shock and reshoring, shifting global trade patterns accelerated by geopolitics, and what regional initiatives such as RCEP and CPTPP will mean for Asia Pacific. With that, it is my pleasure now to hand over to Vasuki Shastri, Associate Fellow at Chatham House. Vasuki is a leading international thinker on Asia's place in the global economy and author of a recently published and highly relevant book called Has Asia Lost It? He is uniquely placed to moderate this series. Vasuki, over to you.
Thank you for those kind words and endorsements, Stephen. Cyn-Young, when the ADB looks at the region, looks at trade flows over the last few years, looks at supply chains, there's a lot of talk about decoupling, there's a lot of talk about reconfiguring supply chains in Asia. What do you see as the main risks for the region, mainly in terms of economic growth and development? And what is ADB's policy advice for member countries?
Well, thank you, Vasuki. And I'm very happy to join this very important discussion today. Well, the pandemic has sent shockwaves across global economic and trade systems. The world merchandise trade in volume in the first 8 months fell sharply by 9% in 2020 compared to a year ago. Although the world have seen the world trade staging a recovery toward the last quarter of 2020, the WTO is now estimated that the overall trade volume have fallen by 6% in 2020. And we have seen a much greater fall in global services trade, which is very unlikely to return to the pre-crisis level anytime soon. The pandemic exposed many weaknesses in global trade and supply systems. These are shown to be highly sensitive to disasters and shocks, mainly due to, I think that the three elements, and those are the geographic concentration of major manufacturers and gaps in infrastructure and logistics. And then third, the configuration of the global supply chain currently have been driven mostly by efficiency. And there has been a lack of consideration for resilience. So let me elaborate some of these. Actually, geographic concentration of the major manufacturers, especially for vaccines and critical medical goods, made the supply of these critical medical goods very vulnerable and sensitive to any localized shocks and changes in national security laws or even trade policies. Secondly, we have seen the disruption in transport, the infrastructure and also logistics. Many economies in response to the COVID pandemic have imposed travel restrictions and then disruptions. And then these have caused significant disruptions to international trade, let alone costing millions of people who are working in this related sectors, jobs and incomes. For example, last year, aviation alone saw 30% reduction in capacity across Asia and Pacific. And the shipping was also severely affected by the quarantines and handling disruptions and at ports. And lastly, infrastructure together with logistics is the backbone of the trade, and Asia Pacific have made a significant progress on this front over the past several decades. But it was really evident and then clear that they are still lagging in digital trade connectivity and facilitation. The pandemic exposed the gaps in automation of document clearance, sub-regional coordination, and implementation of emergency protocols, both nationally and regionally. So these are really significant risks that we have seen during the pandemic. Across the region, we do feel that there is a need to substantially increase investment more in resilient connectivity. I believe that digitalization will play an important role in post-pandemic economic and trade system. Even before the pandemic, digitalization was already happening, and it was helping improve efficiency in trade and then trade facilitation. But it's now accelerating thanks, in some way, the pandemic has been a blessing in disguise that we are turning to cyberspace and then online in much faster. We need to significantly boost investment and expand digital capabilities and improve digital readiness in developing member countries. And we need to also strengthen the international cooperation in the digitalization process, enhance the interoperability of platforms and data security, and harmonize the protocols. We believe that the trade and trade facilitation should embrace much greater digitalization and need to ensure the cross-country information sharing and also mutual acceptance of digital certificates to make sure that in the trade and then a supply chain become more resilient.
Thank you very much, Cyn-Young. And I guess people really underestimate that in facilitating trade flows, the importance of documentation, the importance of digitalization, and the extent to which this can accelerate trade flows or really be an obstacle is a thing that's really not appreciated by many people. So thanks for highlighting that. Min, I'd like to turn to you now to get a sense. Obviously, China is a pivotal player in global trade. A very, very large contributor from Asia. So how does all of these issues look from Beijing, both in the context of the pandemic as well as with these ongoing trade tensions with the US?
Yeah, thank you very much, Vasuki. Thanks for the invitation. It is indeed a great honor for me to join this conference online, and also particularly my great honor to be with very distinguished panelists, Madame Park, and also the Montek who is coming. Indeed, great honor. Thank you once again for the invitation. I would like to make some very straightforward and simple point regarding these issues. The first issues on the supply chain geopolitical risk, I think this is a really hot topic, right? But I think really the geopolitical risk is overemphasized on the supply chain in the current situations. We haven't observed a real global supply chain reconfiguration, reshape, repositioning due to the geopolitical risk, or not yet. I think we should take a more broad view on the supply chain change evolving. Supply chain is always evolving, right? I mean, recall, Vasuki, in your days when we all in the army, even earlier, we have a flood in Thailand, which caused a supply chain shock. Then the earthquake in Japan, right? And the COVID-19 make a trade flow extremely difficult, but very unexpectedly, the geopolitical tension increased dramatically. But recently, Suez Canal issues and also chip crisis also make people really aware of the whole thing. So there's a lot of impact and a lot of facts, in this game. Overall today, I will say the uncertainty is really increased on the supply chain side. The black swan events happen more often than any time before we can record. I think that's the one concern. Geopolitical risk is only the one fact. I think geopolitical in some way play a background noise, so makes this uncertainty more exaggeration, which is a concern. But it is a more broad issue on, I think the companies, the countries will consider basically a few key factors on supply chain issues. Basically, it's efficiency, right? It's a key issue. And resilience is also a key issue that's balanced. And then balance to security issue, which is a new fact, we add them together. But also the uncertainty is also a new fact. I think if we're looking for the future, we need to think about all those things together. Supply chain is evolving all the time. I think it's shaping on, but so far we haven't seen a real substantial change yet. I think those factors will play a role together. I don't think a geopolitical reason is the factor. It's one of that. I think I would like to say that we need to have a more broad view in a sense. The second, for supply chain and also trade flows, I would say, even bigger things is coming now, will change and shape the global supply chain and trade flow as well. Because of time limited, let me point just two things. One is really the technology transformation, digitalization, right? And the internet and the Internet of Things, IoT, on the AR. And that will fundamentally change not only how the trade and the supply chain move physically, go to the virtual world, but more importantly, I see that will change the classical definition of endowments. The whole trade starts with the competitiveness and endowments, right? You have your own endowments, you have your competitiveness, go back to Ricardians at time, right? You do the trade, Adam Smith also support, have the same thought. But I think the technology, really digitalization, will change the whole fundamental definition of endowments. I mean, country have, for example, cheap manual labor, not necessarily being really rich endowments for country to compete with the whole world, right? It is really technology, it's the engineers, right? It's data, I think they will define the trade flow and the competitiveness in the future. It's coming. I think they were even bigger. Service sector, if I point another things, service trade also will play a very important role and in this global trade and the supply chain side. On trade, very clear, service trade grows much stronger than good trade in the past decades. There's a clear evidence. But I would say in supply chain, you will see service trade become more important because service today account 1/3 of a good trade values. So we will see the softer supply chain and harder supply chain is merging, become a new global supply chain. All those service and the manufacturing supply chain and bring them together. And how that will define the whole world and the region and the country and the company position in the new global supply chain. I think this is a big question. It's coming. I think it's very clear in Beijing. I can see technology, digitalization moving so fast, so strong, and change the competitiveness of the company over seconds. It will impact the whole world and the technology. The third point I would like to mention, so within my 6 to 8 minutes, is in Asia. I think Asia, as you mentioned, is a beneficiary for this, COVID-19 crisis in that way. What we observed in the past years, Asia remained the global manufacturing hub. The share of a global manufacturer has increased rather than decreased, although global trade drops more than 6%, right? As Madame Park mentioned, WTO just estimated. But Asia's position is still there. And also more interestingly, within Asian trades and within Asian FDR share also increased. Within Asian trade, roughly increased 0.8% last year, from more than 52% to around 52.8% now. Then FDR also increased around 59% to 60.6% now. So you will see Asia it become more integrated to each other and also globally remain the strong and the manufacturing hub for the whole world. We did in classical trade theory a forward link, backward link study to study all the major manufacturing goods in Asia. We found the forward and backward link in Asia become ever stronger in year 2020. And also in the past 5 years from 2015 to 2019, compared with previous 10, 15 years, and the linkage, integration has been stronger. I think that's good. Obviously, different countries will change a different role, different weight in this big manufacturing hub. Japan used to be a big manufacturing hub in Asia, as well as South Korea. But now China is the biggest one, right? Because China, the manufacturing value added equivalent to the US plus Germany plus Japan together. So it's big. But we also can see, for example, Thailand, for example, Vietnam, right? In some way, Malaysia, Indonesia also increase their shares in the global supply chain as well. And the China manufacturing share in GDP actually has been dropping since the year 2014 now, and the service sector picked up. So within the Asia, the structure, things may change, but I would say overall, our studies shows the Asia will remain the global manufacturing hub and remain a strong supply chain of the part. Because if what really happened on supply chain is people start to think, I have to say not move yet, to form a core products for particular product for particular country, within country made, and build a supply chain around the country, which actually will lead to a more regional centralized supply chain. I think that's the Asian model. And RCEP, clearly I see, will facilitate that process. Yeah, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've got 2 follow-up questions for you, Min. Obviously, the entire dimension of trade and services does not receive much attention. I don't think people talk about TISA, the WTO process, in as much depth and great detail anymore. But one thing that all of us have noticed, of course, is China's own evolving economic strategy over the past year. We've read a lot about dual circulation. So from what you have just described to us as, the big challenges for the region, now, how does this fit in with dual circulation? And how do you still see China playing the critical pivotal role that it has both in manufacturing as well as in global trade? Or is the emphasis now going to be on, domestic consumption?
I think there's two directions. That's a very good question. The one direction, when China moved into the service economy, and service accounted 54.2% of Chinese GDP now, we expect in the next 10 years, and every year, Chinese service sector may get extra, say, 0.5% of the GDP every year. So China is moving more and more towards service sector, I think. And also, when China becomes the second largest global economy, and as usual, consumption play more and more important in terms of for economic growth and economic activities. It's a typical thing if you go back to what happened in Europe and the United States. Service sector accounted more than 78%, and the consumption and the lead really more than 60%, and the GDP and GDP growth as well, right? So China is moving into that direction. I think that's really the global pattern of development. China will follow the same shoes, right? I think that's the one thing we have to see. That's number one. Number two, we obviously observe all those things I mentioned, the uncertainties and all those things, and efficiency versus resilience, all to do that, right? On China's supply chain and manufacturing capacity, in fact, is fully open to international market because the 40 years reform on the openness policies is fully linked to the international market. So in some way, make the whole manufacturing supply chain is and vulnerable in some way, some parts. So it is important for China to think about a little bit of domestic consolidation and make those supply chains and around particularly core issues. But this doesn't mean that China will close the door. China will still fully open to the global trade flow, global competition, and the global supply chain. So there's a dual circulation means one is domestic circulation and one is international circulation. China today even pay more attention on international circulation because clearly, number one, globalization is a trend, it's a continuous, it seems from my point of view, right? And number two, and China need exchange all different things, resource, goods, technology, everything, and with the good. So China will remain and open to the whole world. Yeah, thank you. We saw Montek. Hi, Montek. Good to see you.
We're delighted to have Montek join us. Montek, I think you're on mute. Thanks a lot for joining us, Montek. We've just had a discussion with Minju and Cyn-Young, really focusing on what do supply chain shocks, particularly in the context of the pandemic. We're looking at trade flows, we're looking at supply chains in Asia. And I think India really represents an interesting example of a country that's not fully integrated into Asian supply chains. And India is trying very hard. We have seen headlines that Apple and Foxconn want to move manufacturing into India in the context of the current tensions between the US and China. So really wanted to get your perspective on India's place in the world when we talk about trade flows and supply chains. Can this be a viable driver of growth, particularly at a time when the Indian economy has sharply slowed down? Due to the pandemic, but some of these problems also predate the pandemic. So it'll be great to get your perspective on these issues, and then we'll move on to taking Q&A and have a more detailed conversation.
Well, first of all, let me apologize. Some unavoidable conflicts of calendar prevented me from joining at the time that I would have wanted to join, so I apologize. You know, I think we're looking at multiple things that are happening right now. One is clearly the pandemic. The other is a change in the geopolitical situation in the world, which I don't think is temporary. I mean, the pandemic is actually more serious than a mere temporary event. But I'm still hoping that, let's say, a year from now, when enough vaccination has taken place in enough countries, uh, we will get to a post-pandemic world. The geopolitical changes that are taking place, which sort of effectively move away from what for a very long time was a kind of political unipolarity with rising other powers, but the US remaining the dominant power and kind of underpinning a sort of commitment to a global economic world. That has actually changed. And I don't think that that change is temporary. I mean, knowledgeable people always expected the rise of China would significantly alter the balance, just the economic balance. The other developing countries, middle-income countries, are also rising. So the decline in the share of the United States in global output was almost certain to happen. But I think the fact that the US is now, it would have been one thing if the US had met with a large number of middle-income countries all increasing their share. But the way it has happened is that China's been able to, as it were, dominate this growing space. And that has essentially meant kind of a move to a sort of a G2 type of situation. And the sort of tensions that have arisen around that, I mean, I'm no expert on it, but I don't think that these are going to be easily overcome. A lot depends, of course, on what the Chinese government itself does. I've no doubt that the Chinese government wants to remain open in terms of trading. But I think many other things would have to sort of fall into place for people to think that what you're seeing now is a geopolitical world which allows for a great deal of cooperation. I mean, that assumption has been shaken. And I think that'll clearly affect attitudes towards integrating trade flows. It'll certainly create the perception that you don't want to be too dependent on trade flows that are dominated by one large player on the supply side, and I think that's a factor. What is India going to do? Well, I mean, as you say, India is experiencing negative growth this year, but of course, the whole world is experiencing negative growth except China and the United States. Seem to be doing well. The United States did in the year in 2020 experience a contraction, but they seem to be getting out of it much faster. China didn't have a contraction, but they sort of growth is picking up. India had a significant contraction, like many other countries, and I think there's begun a recovery process. So the coming year will certainly be a year of positive growth. I mean, the most recent projection that I saw of the IMF actually increases the growth rate in the coming year to something like 12.5%, following maybe an 8% decline. But still, that doesn't mean that India is on a high growth path. So the point you made, Vasuki, that even prior to the pandemic, Indian growth had slowed down. I think that's an issue which is being discussed in India. I mean, clearly we've come up against constraints that make the earlier, I think for 10 years or so, we had an average growth rate of 7.6%. I mean, some good years when it was above 8, some bad years when it wasn't, but the average was pretty good, 7.6%. It has slowed down quite a bit. So question number one for India is, will this growth pick up? And secondly, what is India's attitude going to be on the trade front? Now, you know, what has happened, I think, is that you're getting mixed messages. I mean, if you ask the Indian government, what is your attitude towards global supply chains? The answer is very clear that we want India to be part of global supply chains, but we want to strengthen our own capacity to be competitive. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. You really need to ask yourself, what exactly are we going to do to increase our competitiveness, and to what extent are we simply going to rely on raising protective tariffs? Now, this is a subject being debated in India. I mean, my personal view is that there are many things that we have to do to become more competitive, and that's what we should be focusing on. Raising tariffs is not one of them. It's a different matter if there are some particularly sensitive items where somehow you want to reduce dependence on the rest of the world because you're launching a big push. Whether you're doing enough to launch the big push is something that needs to be carefully considered. But by and large, India's tariff rates are too high in my view, and I have consistently maintained that we should be lowering them. And certainly, if we want to integrate with the Asian economies, which is clearly what we should be doing, I mean, this is the part of the globe which is on the whole going to have rapid growth, not just China, of course, but not just China, even the other Asian countries. And in order to integrate with it in terms of trade, my view is we should be moving to tariff levels that are much closer to those that prevail in this part of the world. There are Indian business, like business all over the world, is very nervous about competing with China. There's the image of not being a fair competitor. Businessmen always say competitors are not fair, so you need to have some objective way of judging that. But there is concern about non-transparency, hidden subsidies, dumping, things like that. And I expect that those tensions are likely to continue for a while. But you know, once the world economy starts growing again, and that's critical, if the world economy starts growing, world trade starts growing, then, and enough people sense that there's a turnaround, then some of the easy relapses into protectionist policies might get headed off. But you know, at the moment, given what's happening in the world, and given the tendency in many of the advanced countries to resort to protectionist policies, I'm not entirely surprised that you're seeing certainly countries like India follow suit. This requires very careful thinking and strategic planning by the government of India. The good news is that what the government says is that it wants to join global supply chains. The other good news, I think, is that India is very open on foreign direct investment. It's no longer singing the tune of the 1970s, which was anti-foreign investment, anti-foreign technology, and so on. So they want to be open to foreign investment, want to bring in foreign investment, want to use foreign investment to make India part of the global supply chain. Now, how effectively we can do it, whether we understand the nature of business hesitations in this matter, this only time will tell. But you know, certainly in terms of the overall flows of FDI, I mean, compared to the past and compared to India's expectations, the flows have been quite good. What we need really is foreign investors to be reassured that India is back on some kind of a path of good growth. What is good growth? You know, in my view, I mean, if we don't get back to a growth rate of something of the order of 7% or so, we're going to have serious problems in creating employment. And I mean, you hear a lot of people domestically say, you know, we shouldn't focus on growth, we should focus on jobs. It's certainly true that politically, it's the lack of jobs or the lack of growth in jobs which creates the biggest problem. But there's no way that you're going to get a growth in jobs if you don't get an acceleration in growth either. So I think the two are just two sides of the same coin. You know, the last point I want to make is, and I really don't know enough about this, a lot of people tell me that the way AI is moving, and this is all, I mean, I don't think we should connect it with the pandemic, although I think there's too much of a tendency to say the pandemic is changing everything. I mean, this has been happening for some time. But the way AI is moving, it might quite significantly alter the relative role of multiple components being put together, etc., and so on, parceled out to different producers. I mean, if you have additive manufacturing, then many complex components that were maybe earlier made in putting two or three different things together might all be manufactured as a single piece. And those kinds of things will certainly alter the tendency to spread out manufacturing and broaden the supply chain. Now, what that will do, frankly, we don't know. And what its regional implications will be, we don't know. I don't think, I think people are now sufficiently sensitive to the concerns that we need less, we need to avoid over-dependence on any one dominant supply chain. So the business of developing supply chains becomes more competitive. This is an opportunity for India, because if we can get all our other policies together, maybe we can persuade the world that, look, India wants to join in these supply chains. And I'm pretty sure that as we do that, we ourselves will have to be more open. I mean, joining the supply chain doesn't mean internalizing the whole supply chain into India. It does mean kind of bringing things from elsewhere and adding value to them and moving them to other destinations. And that requires a very much more open trade policy. So that will be the challenge. How do we manage trade policy to make that possible? So for India, I mean, it's getting the growth back, which is very crucial. Remaining open to foreign investment, foreign technology, the objective of linking up with supply chains, avoiding a resort to tariff-based protectionism, which I think is not the way to go, and just hoping that the world moves to a greater degree of trust. I mean, at the moment, we're in a position where many of the institutions that underpin cooperation amongst nations have been seriously eroded. I mean, for example, at the moment, I know the Biden administration is giving many different signals on many areas compared to the previous administration, but I'm not sure that we've got a clear signal about what they're going to do as far as trade is concerned. Not just that free trade arrangements that they used to be pursuing no longer seem to command any interest in Congress. It's not even clear to me whether fixing the problems with the WTO's appellate process is actually going to move any further very quickly. So there are some very big questions which remain unanswered.
Thank you so much, Montek. A lot to unpack there. We also have a number of questions coming in, but before I get to that, I wanted to ask Cyn-Young for ADB's perspective on RCEP and CPTPP. Now, it's very clear that the Biden administration has indicated that they've got no immediate interest in rejoining CPTPP. There's signals from Beijing of potential interest in joining CPTPP, which is really going to be very interesting geopolitical exercise. So how does ADB look at these two free trade agreements? These regional trade agreements, are they going to add to regional trade flows at a time when you've got a lot of conventional free trade agreements in the region, which already provide access to trade in goods?
I have to share my view rather than the ADB's view, because I don't really, to my knowledge, I don't think ADB has any institutional view on the RCEP or CPTPP. I think the Dr. Montek, in fact, raised a very interesting point about the growing kind of like a geopolitical tension among the G2, in a way that's the world largest trading partners, the two largest trading partners now. And the COVID-19 has, as I mentioned earlier, exposed quite a bit significant weaknesses and then vulnerabilities of the current, the globalized the trading and also supply chain systems. And in that regard, there's a feeling of trust in the past and then at least up to pandemic of that globalization trend. And many, at least in Asia Pacific, I believe that the countries have recognized that there has to be a renewed commitment to the open trade, to at least among the groups of the economies where there are greater sort of economic linkages, and then there's also the reliance on exports and trade for growth. So those are the economies, surrounding ASEAN +3, which initially started RCEP. And COVID pandemic, in a way, gave some impetus to reignite the momentum of RCEP negotiations, and that led to a signing last November, in November 2019, which really signifies, I believe, that the return of open regionalism, at least for these RCEP economies. So it's a very positive momentum. The RCEP remains open to any new members, even for India, which have paused on entry for now, still has the right to return upon any beginning of the RCEP. And this also, gives a very interesting the structure in a way in terms of that RCEP agreement. This is quite flexible. It actually accommodates different levels of development across RCEP members and provide really sufficient time for developing countries to be able to go through their domestic reforms and then meet the international agreement. I mean, at least this RCEP agreement, those are requirements under RCEP. So it really allows the entry of many developing countries, and but it still is in the setup of really rule-based, multilateralized trading system. So it actually has its own the rules of origin, and then also it has established the RCEP international standard. There are a lot of provisions in terms of trade facilitations, and also even the provision for the in great sort of capacity building for developing countries. So in the package, this encouraged the expansion of the member beyond RCEP once the RCEP really takes its own kind of momentum, and then we believe that it really fosters the capacity building and then the trade facilitation for developing country to join the global trade, and then also the supply chain systems through like harmonize the rules of origin. So ADB is ready to provide a lot of support in terms of developing countries meeting the requirement of under RCEP, and then providing support for the trade facilitation, and then also helping their capacity building.
Thank you very much. Min and Montek, we have a question here on decarbonization, and I'm just going to expand the scope a bit to really look at climate change. And the question really is, should the shipping industry decarbonize? And if all countries are going to meet in Glasgow in November, are going to fulfill the obligations to combat global climate change. So when you look at trade, when you look at this deeply interconnected trading system that we have, is it fit for purpose in this new world where we are talking about adaptation and mitigation of climate change? Min, you first.
Great, thank you. The first is really nice to see Montek, although virtually. I haven't seen Montek for a while, and Montek, it looks so well. It's really, really nice. And thanks, Vasuki, to bring us together. Decarbonization and the carbon neutrality is a big, big drive force for the global future trade flow and also for global supply chain. I have no doubt about that. I mean, just take a transportation section, right? I mean, I think transportation, we're moving from gas and today to electricity and other renewable energies. The technical path is not all clear yet, but destination is very clear. I don't think that in 30 years, in the major countries or area, we'll see any gas-burned car run in the street. So that will change the whole auto supply chain and the trade flow as well. But there's a more impact if the world is really moving into this carbon neutrality. I think we're moving in, but also depends on end of this year's conference, we'll see what's going on there. But the carbon footprint and those type of things will get into the trade flow. As we talk about WTO, the fishing actually is a part of an environmental deal, right? And agriculture negotiation will be part of environmental and the carbon neutrality issue now. So when I say in my opening remark, technology will be an even big factor to shape the future trade and supply chain, I include the carbon neutrality, because the carbon neutrality means not only energy, but fundamental technology change. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Montek, your views?
Well, thank you, Vasuki. And Zhu, let me say hi to you. You look very good too, and it's good to meet virtually. I agree with what Zhu said, that when we look at decarbonization, I mean, let's be very clear about it. If we act, we know from the work of the IPCC that after about 2050, there should be zero net emissions in the world if you want to stick with the 1.5 degrees centigrade warming limit. So the world as a whole by 2050 has to get to net zero. Now, what I'm not very happy about is that all of a sudden the advanced countries have picked 2050 as a target date, and they now want everyone else to adopt the same target date. Now, even if the world has to get to 2050, it's not at all logical to say that all countries have to get to get to net zero by the same date. I mean, in fact, the advanced countries ought to aim to get there much earlier and allow the developing countries that are further behind and have much lower levels of per capita GDP emissions and so on to get there later. Now, I mean, I don't know how these discussions are actually ever going to be carried out. I mean, to think that in the COP26, you're going to get agreement on this is not actually true, because the discussions thus far amounts to countries asserting their own targets. I mean, that's the framework. And I think it's true that countries have, this was the big change that occurred in Paris, that countries decided voluntarily to accept certain targets. Even the developing countries, which earlier used to say that, look, we didn't cause the problem, so why should we take on commitments? Even they said, look, we'll take on commitments. The problem really was that the commitments that were taken on, even then it was known, would not get you to the kind of limitation of global warming to the extent to which you wanted. Quite apart from the fact that the United States more or less withdrew for 5 years, and it's now come back in. But during that period, there's much less of moving to what should have been a reasonable target. So I think, we are in a fix on decarbonization. I totally agree with Zhu that what is going to make a difference is technology. Look, the broad thing that has to be done is, number one, we need to electrify whatever is possible to be electrified. So the source of energy should not be fossil fuels directly, but should be electricity as much as possible, including generation of heat. And at a second stage, we need to move from fossil fuel-based electricity to green electricity. Some hydrocarbon is possible, but most of it would have to be wind and solar. Now, that's going to be a long haul, and for many of us, it's going to take longer than people think. China, I think, has quite rightly said that they've set a target for China of 2060 for net zero. I've recently published something in a magazine, in one of our papers, Mint, on what should be India's approach. And I've basically said that, look, developing countries cannot all get there in 2050. The developed countries should get there faster. We should get there later. And, we need time to get to peaking before we can start falling. I've suggested that one way of judging what India should do is, if you take a leaf out of China's book and say, well, look, China's saying net zero by 2060, what should India say? I think one reasonable way of approaching this is to say that, look, we will also get to net zero when our per capita GDP reaches the level that China's per capita GDP will reach in 2060. Now, of course, for this, you need projections. And fortunately, the OECD makes all kinds of projections. And if you take their projections at face value, you can come to the conclusion that if China says 2060, well, India should get to net zero by 2080. But, in order for India to get to net zero by 2080, India has to start very soon. We ought to determine what is a target date for peaking, how do we go down, how do we phase out the use of carbon for generating electricity, etc., etc. Now, the question that triggered all this was really shipping. Now, to be honest, I don't know technologically enough about shipping, but my guess is that shipping is going to be the last one that's going to be able to go completely electric. So to that extent, if shipping is going to be dependent on fossil fuels for the foreseeable future, and if the pricing of fossil fuels reflects a carbon tax, then what it means is that transcontinental transportation is going to be a lot more expensive. And that is certainly going to reduce the economics of globalization and probably discourage, let's say, an untrammeled growth of supply chains with goods moving all over the place 3 or 4 times. There are longer term developments which one can see would move in a certain direction that would weaken what was earlier a thrust of globalization. But I don't know enough about the technology. And remember, we're talking about 20, 30 years down the road. Even in the last 10 years, the improvements that we've seen in solar energy have been quite remarkable. Certainly on electric vehicles have been quite remarkable. What happens to storage, battery storage, and its economics is going to be absolutely crucial. because the ability to integrate renewable energy into a grid which requires stabilization of supply to match demand is going to depend crucially on the cost of storage. And there I believe some progress is being made, but people who believe in technology always say that, look, you underestimate how much technology can achieve. And so let's hope that they're really right. In all of this, it's if the advanced countries take the lead and push and really decide to get on with developing the relevant technology, then the developing countries will be easily able to piggyback. And what's more, if the technological changes are made in the advanced countries, I mean, the developing countries will find themselves faced either with old-fashioned technologies, or they'll have to move to the more fuel-efficient technologies of the future. And they have quite a lot of time. I mean, some of these machines don't have such a long life. So if new technologies are coming, let's say 15 years down the road, then quite a lot of the capacity that gets built up can be very quickly changed before the deadline. But it's also true what Mark Carney, I think, said several years ago, that if we are going to reduce fossil fuels to the extent that is necessary to save the planet, then half the fossil fuel reserves in the world available several years ago should never be used. But it's quite clear that markets didn't believe this, because otherwise there should have been a crash in the stock prices of companies whose prices depend on reserves of fossil fuels. That didn't happen. So you've got this peculiar situation where important decision makers are acting as if it's not going to happen. But if it doesn't happen, the earth is going to burn up with all kinds of horrendous consequences. And frankly, I think it's not easy to predict how this will move, but I expect to see a number of lurching moves forward. One good news, I think, across the board is that many, many more people in developing countries are now concerned about climate change. I mean, people can see the effect that it would have. It's certainly true in India. Forget about climate change. In the case of reliance on coal for electricity generation, people see the effect in air pollution and what that does to health. And that degree of awareness is much greater amongst the young than amongst the older people. So how that will play out in the next 10 years, we have to see.
Thank you. We've almost run out of time, but I wanted to give Min an opportunity to come in.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is such an important issue. I would like to add the footnotes, the 2 points. The first point, I very much agree with Montek mentioned on, is this a big challenge for emerging market and a low-income country? Because the key issues for us, we're still growing, right? But then we are asked to consume less and less fossil fuel and energy, which is really a big challenge. Because most of the European countries, for example, when they move to carbon neutrality, their growth is much lower, right? Around 2%. And they hold economic sectors in service sector. So, and they also from 90 to 50, they have 60 years. So it's really relatively, it's a model there for them. But for emerging market, low-income country, the speed, the scale, and the growth pressure balance to each other is a huge challenge. But my second point is say, the carbon neutrality is coming, it's real. Although a lot of concerns, Montek mentioned, market not fully anticipate and not priced in yet, I think it's coming. Transportation is the key issue and have a huge impact on supply chain. I'll give you a case in China. China did a target in 2030. China will say the 40% car produced in China will be electricity car. Today, the global average is 1.7%. In China, it's around 5%. And China is the biggest auto market in the whole world. So 40% is a big number. It will change the whole market and the industry. But wait a second. This is only say the electricity cost, right? We haven't looked into really the hydrogen cost, which is another new energies, and where more and more believe the future energy for transportation is really hydrogen. It's not electricity now. So the whole industry supply chain will really moving away from today's existing manufacturing supply chain, maybe moving into not even mention hybrids cost, right? Just electricity cost, but maybe also further move into the hydrogen cost, which is huge change and huge uncertainty and technology is the whole thing. The third point Montek mentioned are also support. Technology is the whole thing. So the technology transfer is really a big issue under this carbon neutrality. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think there's inadequate attention on the issue of decarbonization and its impact on trade and supply chain. So thank you for highlighting this. Ladies and gentlemen, we've unfortunately run out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists, Cyn-Young, Minju, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. I'd like to thank AIG for the support. The second part of our webinar series will continue on May 17th, when we'll take a deep dive into US-China relations, and that will really be focused on geopolitics. More details will be forthcoming in the next few weeks, and I hope all of you can join. Thank you all very much. Have a good day.